Chapter 27, World War II. There won't be a quiz on this chapter. We're not going to spend a lot of time. I'll definitely emphasize some of the important concepts as we go through it. All right, so World War I leads into World War II. There's definitely a connection. As we mentioned in the last chapter, we have the rise of totalitarianism, the rise of fascism, increasing nationalism. Obviously, those isms are emerging. So Hitler pretty much he's elected into power, or he's voted into power, and from that point on, he basically goes on to violate almost all the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and most importantly, he begins to militarize. He wins over the people because of his promises: jobs, economic prosperity. He promised paid vacations and a return to glory, and most importantly, regaining land lost under the Treaty of Versailles. So one of his first military actions is to order troops into the Rhineland, which goes against the Treaty of Versailles. This is the Rhineland. It was kind of considered a buffer zone. It was taken away from Germany after World War II, but Hitler believed it was theirs. So he goes in there again. He puts forces in that region, and it's the beginning of the end in a sense. The League of Nations, we talked about the League of Nations that was created after World War I as part of the Treaty of Versailles. Actually, Woodrow Wilson's birthchild. But it was pretty ineffective. The United States was not a part of it. The League just didn't have that ability to summon any kind of military force or really unify the world against any expansionism. And in this case, Germany was allowed to pretty much do what they wanted to do. The term appeasement is important. You might see it on a test. England and France were not interested early on in combating German forces for a lot of reasons. One, it wasn't a popular idea in England. They're recovering from war. The militaries of both countries were weakened and rebuilding. Both countries were struggling from the Great Depression. Their recoveries weren't as quick as, say, Germany's. So they basically made a deal. It was the Munich Pact, actually. And they agreed to allow Hitler to kind of extend some of his territory in return for promises not to expand further. It was believed that actually, some people believed that Hitler would actually stop the spread of communism, that Hitler would serve as a check to the Soviet Union. So not everyone in Europe was really ultra concerned about Hitler or thought that he would eventually do what he ends up doing. Another term that you might see is Lebensraum. It's a German word for living space, and this is one motivation. Hitler also wanted land, not some, for natural resources, but also for living space, expand the German population. The idea, too, would be that Germany would be able to feed its people and not be so reliant on the United States for wheat. We were a major exporter of everything: oil, wheat, other products, especially after World War I. The war wasn't fought in the United States. Our economy kind of boomed because of the war. So we were really feeding the world in a sense. So that's, again, a motivation for German expansion, Lebensraum. All right, the Munich Pact, we mentioned it was a deal in 1938. Hitler wanted the Sudetenland. It was a part of Czechoslovakia, and England and France appeased him. That's appeasement. They gave him that territory. In return, Hitler promised not to go any further. He violates that pact and basically invades Czechoslovakia. So I don't know if you recognize the cartoonist. Dr. Seuss spent a lot of time as a propagandist, or as a political commentator. This is one of his famous cartoons showing, England on the island appeasing, giving the Nazi dragons or sea monsters lollipops. And the caption is, "Remember, one more lollipop and then you all go home." So this is a good criticism, or he's criticizing, obviously, the purpose of the document is to, not purpose, but the point of view, or not the point of view, actually the main idea is, criticism of the appeasement policy. Basically Dr. Seuss was kind of right, that appeasement was a failed policy. Some people argue it was a good policy because it gave England a chance to rebuild their military. England defended very effectively the German onslaught. They were one of the European countries that was not invaded. So you could make the argument that appeasement was the right military strategy. Again, it did give England time to prepare for war, which they did effectively. Poland. So 1939, Poland was a turning point. This is when the European powers declare war on Hitler. He signs a non-aggression pact with Stalin. That's important to remember. He and Stalin agree not to attack each other. Hitler's going to violate that as well eventually. Poland with his Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is kind of his military total war onslaught, kind of throwing the whole kitchen sink at the enemy. And eventually, or that leads to England and France declaring war. So that's why we consider Poland, or the invasion of Poland, a turning point. So Japan also was looking to expand its territory, like Germany. They were looking for living space, but they're probably motivated more by natural resources. They're industrializing as well, right? They're militarizing, and they need oil, right? They need other resources like coal. So they did. Remember, they controlled Korea after the Russo the Japanese Russo War back in the late 1800s, and they had already kind of also had some territory in Manchuria. But they kind of gained most of Manchuria in 1931. If you recall, Manchuria is kind of like northern China. During the Qing dynasty, the Manchurians were kind of in control of China. So really, it had always been kind of a separate region, but after the Qing dynasty, it really was part of China. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, but really there was nothing much they could do. As we know, they were a very weak international peacekeeping organization, and Japan ends up withdrawing from the League. So remember, if you go back, to the kind of our Chinese history lessons in the last chapter, remember China was kind of divided. You had the nationalists who were kind of anti-communist under Chiang Kai-shek, and Mao Zedong, who led the Communist Party. They unified because they recognized that Japan was a major threat, and Japan does that. They go into China, into Nanjing, which was the capital, and they basically devastate civilians there. And it's a famous, not famous, but an infamous historical event, also known as the Nanjing Massacre or the Rape of Nanjing, where thousands of innocent civilians are murdered. So again, like Germany, Japan is also expanding. Here's Dr. Seuss again, right? You might see a cartoon like this on the test. He was a famous, obviously, author, but he was, at the time, well known for his political commentaries. Think about the point of view, right? And obviously, he was highly critical of the Japanese. His cartoons are actually somewhat racist at times. The way he portrayed the Japanese people, their physical features. So looking back, we kind of we're highly critical of his beliefs. But there's the caption. Now, what in blazes am I going to use for Jews? And basically, that would probably be the people of China. The Nanjing Massacre was probably Japan's version of the Holocaust. And here's Manchuria right here, northern China, but again, it was always a separate region. And here's Korea. So this is all part of Japanese territory by 1942. Not all of China, but more of the eastern section of China. French Indochina, which would be Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of these regions, they would seize the Philippines from the United States, and they basically had themselves an empire. They also had their sights on Australia. The United States actually jumps into war with them, not only because of Pearl Harbor, because of their aggressive actions towards Australia and some of the islands that the United States had territory in, like the Marshall Islands. All right, so it's a new order in East Asia, right? Japan is now the major power, and they seek more territory. But the United States did have a weapon, which would be economic sanctions. They knew that Japan needed oil, and they stopped supplying Japan with oil. Remember, the United States was the supreme oil producer. Saudi Arabia was not yet a country. So Japan retaliates by attacking our naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, and the purpose of that was to disable our Navy. If our Pacific fleet was destroyed, then basically FDR wouldn't be able to slow down Japanese expansionism. It didn't work, fortunately, because most of our aircraft carriers were actually out to sea. So even though we lost a lot of our fleet, our primary weapon of choice, the carrier, was preserved, or many of the carriers were preserved. Here's another Dr. Seuss cartoon, right? The end of you can't see the caption. It says the end of the nap, right? And obviously this is what drags us into war would be the attack on Pearl Harbor. All right, so focusing on the home front, this is probably this is specifically referenced in the curriculum. You're probably not going to have to know any of the battles. They're going to focus more on the role governments played during war. And this is a continuation of what happened in World War II, World War I, I should say. World War II was also a total war, and that means the government, everyone was involved. Civilians, government, everyone took part in it in some way. I think it's also important to remember that the government did play a big role in these wars. They would control prices, they would control or regulate production, and wage controls. They made sure that corporations or companies were paying their workers well, because the last thing the government needed was a strike that would slow down war production. This is a plan. This is the nationalizing of an economy in a sense, but our government, justified it because it was during a time of war, and these companies profited, incredibly because of this. So they probably weren't complaining too much. Also, a draft is a great example of a total war effort, and I think women in both wars gained a lot of maybe not necessarily power per se, but maybe a sense of entitlement, a sense of purpose, self-esteem. So women are working in these factories and getting it done. The Rosie the Riveter campaign was a great example of propaganda, right? Getting women to, do their part. Notice, how she's portrayed, makeup, right? It's still to kind of, strengthen the view of a woman, right? Which is, yeah, you're working, but don't forget your traditional role, right? To look pretty and to be a homemaker. So kind of still reinforces that patriarchal, ideology that was still in existence everywhere. Other propaganda campaign posters promoted rationing, the conservation of food. That continues from World War I. Germany was less successful in terms of getting the people to organize. They often relied on forced labor, Jews and French citizens who were now under German control. And because of that, the productivity was very low. In fact, there are stories of Jewish workers sabotaging machinery and productivity, weapons production. The Japanese also didn't really use the total war system. They didn't want to use women. They felt that it was still important to maintain that family system. Again, a women's role was at home, not in a factory, and they maintained that, and might have hurt them in the long run. Another example of perhaps government intervention would be the internment of Japanese. We believed that the Japanese were a threat, and because of that, President Roosevelt ordered an executive order to intern Japanese Americans. Again, it's just another example of total war, and that includes the government really, extending their powers over the people. Couple of posters that I've always found to be really fascinating. When I was a kid, my father was a World War II buff, and I remember these posters in one of his books, and the one on the right terrified me. And that was the point, right? To terrify the American people. Even though it was 1979 or 80, as a 9-year-old, this freaked me out. So imagine how it impacted Americans in 1945, right? Demonizing the Japanese. And the idea, the purpose is to get Americans to join up, right? To scare people into conserving or joining the army or working in a factory. And then here we go. I like this one. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. That kind of, encouraging people to conserve gasoline, right? And if you don't, then you're only helping Hitler. So, definitely a concept that could be on the exam, analyzing the use of propaganda. And again, they played on our emotions, scaring people into doing more. And then this is the one that I think is really, buy war bonds. If you don't, right, Nazis are going to take over our country and destroy our children, right? Again, playing on our emotion of fear and here symbols of patriotism: the hat, the flag, the plane, and again the swastika, like the shadow taking over the families. And what do they? What does our government want? Buy those bonds. If you buy those bonds, we'll defeat Germany. All right, so a couple of things on Allied victory. How did we win? Strong alliances. We had England and the USSR that was fighting alongside of us at one time. We had an alliance with the Soviets. The D-Day invasion, the famous D-Day, if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, that was kind of a turning point where we liberate France after Germany had taken control of France. General Dwight Eisenhower, who became our president, was the leader of that invasion, and it was very successful. It's the beginning of the end for Germany, basically. Once we push Germany out of France, that's kind of it. We begin to circle Germany as a result of that battle. And how did we defeat the Japanese? Island hopping. I could see this on an exam. The idea of taking smaller islands, setting up naval bases or air bases on those islands, and then launching new offenses. The goal, getting as close to Japan as possible. The final attack would be on Japan, and that was kind of a controversy. We knew that a land invasion of Japan would really be deadly for all sides. So we came up with another strategy. We also had excellent technology back then. We had superior aircraft carriers and submarines that helped us defeat both the Japanese and the German navies. So what wins the war? Again, Truman had a dilemma. Do we attack Japan directly? But the fear was the estimates would be brutal. 140,000 Japanese civilian deaths, hundreds of thousands, if not more, American soldiers dying. So to avoid that, Truman dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's also a belief that Truman was concerned about the Soviet Union's expansionism. Not only were the Soviets starting to enter into Manchuria, but they had their sights on parts of Japan. It was believed that if they had helped us invade Japan and defeat Japan, they too would have wanted a piece of Japan. So to kind of stop the Soviet expansionism or their possible conquering of Japan, we dropped the bomb and end the war before the Soviets could enter in on our side. We wanted them to defeat Germany, but at the same time, we wanted them to kind of, back off a little bit. So that was definitely on Truman's mind. What was the main reason? I would probably argue it was to avoid casualties. That he knew an invasion of Japan would last forever. Maybe we would eventually win, but the cost would be so significant that more people would have died through invasion than, say, the atomic bomb attacks. All right, so as a result, we have a new world order. And this is probably the change, right? After World War II, we have the idea of the superpower emerges. And the two superpowers were the Soviet Union and the United States. I think that's a good example of an essay topic. How did things change globally? And this would be the answer. With that, though, came a lot of conflict. Not necessarily direct military conflict, but a lot of Cold War tensions. And, there were wars in Vietnam, there were wars in Korea, and there were conflicts throughout Europe. So after World War II, the big three met, or at least during the war. And the idea would be, what do we do with Germany once it's defeated? And the big three were the United States, Russia, and England, and they met in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and they came up with a strategy first for winning the war. And the Soviets promised that they would free Eastern European countries who were under Hitler's control. And at the same time, the Soviets would gain some territory, especially in Poland. So basically, it's the idea of what do we do as the war, as we win the war. Then they meet in 1944 in Yalta. Yalta, I believe, I forget where that is. I think it's in Germany, maybe. They start to, as the war ends in Europe and Germany's defeated, the big three make plans for Germany. And basically, Germany is divided into half, east and west. And the city of Berlin, the capital, which was in East Germany, was also divided into communist and democratic sections. And as I mentioned, West Germany was propped up and supported by the West. East Germany was basically turned into a communist satellite nation. And that was part of the deal. We had to appease Stalin to some extent. Stalin, though, did promise free elections, but he reneges on that, and that's a major turning point. At Yalta, he promises the people of Czechoslovakia and Poland could elect whatever or choose whatever government they wanted, but he didn't follow up on that, and that's going to lead to growing distrust. That conference will be followed up by the Potsdam Conference. It's there where this is where Truman actually announces to Stalin that he has an atomic weapon. He doesn't actually say atomic weapon. It's believed he did that to kind of, again, kind of check Stalin a bit, check Stalin's expansionism. He was also angry because by that time, I think this is 1945, Stalin was not doing what he had promised to do. It's here where they do make plans for dealing with Japan. But this is the turning point. You could argue this is when the Cold War begins, when Truman makes the reference that he has an atomic weapon. It's believed that that was an inference, like not only will we end this war with Japan, stopping your ability to take Japan, but hey, if we have to, we'll use this on you down the road. Obviously, he didn't say it that way, but it was believed that Stalin already had the technology on his own, so he was also building one at that point in time too. But I think Potsdam was a turning point, could be the first step towards the Cold War. And then from that, we also have the birth of the United Nations. Remember, the League of Nations was a failure. The U.S. was not involved in that. Even though Woodrow Wilson proposed it, the U.S. did not join. And that's followed by a more effective peacekeeping alliance, the United Nations. Franklin Roosevelt is the kind of the innovator. There are different there's an assembly where they debate issues. And then there's the Security Council, which was made up at the time of France, the US, England, Russia, and China. And they kind of, even today, the Security Council really, they take the lead in dealing with countries that, like, say, North Korea, that might be, getting too big for their britches. Right now, Russia and China are challenging the Security Council and maybe perhaps not doing enough to slow down, North Korea's powers. So even today, the United Nations, the member countries struggle to kind of be unified at times. But you could argue it's been very effective throughout since the 1940s in preventing World War III, right? That was the purpose, to prevent another war. It's also during this time that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is established. Again, it was the birth child of Roosevelt and his wife. And this is important, right? It's an international declaration of human rights. And it's this idea that the United Nations and the member nations would always provide aid and military support to address genocide and oppression. When we see the movie Hotel Rwanda that focuses on the Rwandan massacres, it's the United Nations that has sent in a force to kind of help at least protect people who were in danger. And they struggle. You'll see it during the film that they too were under the gun. There's also an International Court of Justice to kind of bring, I guess, just more or less kind of settle conflict between nations. Not necessarily to bring a trial against a leader. And also the United Nations looks to protect refugees. So today Syrian refugees are being helped by the United Nations, and they're being placed in different countries for their protection. So all of those things are things that the UN does. So definitely something I could see on the exam. Again, major changes, right? We talk about globalization, how the United States is not so isolated anymore, and we do intervene, but we try to intervene with the United Nations seal of approval in a sense. So we may not just jump into a country. We wouldn't intervene in a nation unless the United Nations backed us. Right, what are some of the world agencies that emerge? International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These are economic institutions. I've seen the World Bank walking down Washington, D.C. I kind of, all of a sudden, I'm standing in front of it, and I'm like, oh, wow, that's the World Bank. And the idea was to promote economic opportunity, help developing countries. Remember, we don't want to see, another Hitler emerge. We were trying to slow the spread of communism. Both communism and totalitarianism, they rose because the people were struggling as a result of the Great Depression. So the idea would be to kind of help poor countries avert, revolution and to slow down the spread of communism. And you could argue they've both been very effective, but like anything, there's controversy involved in both of these organizations. Also, we have the Nuremberg trials. I could see that on the exam. Nazi leaders were tried, and actually Japanese military leaders were tried, executed, and convicted for their crimes, which basically was, at least for the Nazis, 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews were murdered. Also, Soviet prisoners and others persecuted, like disabled people with disability, homosexuals, lots of different groups that were targeted. And I think it's important, it set a precedent, and this is something to remember, that going forward, leaders of nations that perform war crimes would be held accountable. And that would happen down the road where, leaders, we'll touch this in the last unit, leaders that perform genocide or the Rwandan leaders of the Rwandan massacre were held accountable for their actions. But there's always the question, what about Truman? Were his attacks on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, were those considered war crimes? So that's still debated today. Was that the right thing to do? All right, that's it, guys. Chapter 27.